The inside of a courtroom is a fascinating place. Our founding fathers believed that the right to be tried by a jury of our peers was so important that it merited inclusion in the highest law in the land. That's why the Amendments 6 and 7 of the Bill of Rights contains this right to have a jury. And the founding fathers included jury trials in the Constitution because they sincerely believed jury trials prevent tyranny. Tyranny exists when absolute power is vested in a singular ruler. But jury trials are the opposite because the citizens on the jury are given the absolute power to make the final decision. Over a year ago, I was summoned for jury duty in Hamilton County. I showed up at the designated time. I was told by some friends beforehand that I would have little chance of being selected for duty. Now, the reason for that is, as a pastor, generally one of the sides, either the defense or the prosecution, would see having a clergy on the jury, they might see it as a disadvantage to their side. This was a petit jury, meaning only 6 jurors would be selected, with a 7th as an alternate. The petit jury is required when it's a case that carries, well, a less serious charge. So I joined 40 people. We showed up at the Hamilton County Courthouse. With only 7 selected, I thought my chance of being selected was getting even slimmer. But for some reason, I was chosen, and I'm glad I was. When you consider a trial, the key players of a trial are the judge, of course, the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, and the jurors. There's also this person who records the proceedings. They are called the stenographer. The trial I was a part of took place in one day. I observed that everything about the trial was fair. The judge was professional and unbiased. The defense attorney defended their client to the best of their ability. The prosecuting attorney presented the facts without trying to persuade the jury through mudslinging or name-calling. The jury arrived at a decision after a thoughtful deliberation of the evidence. A fair and just verdict was arrived upon. I thought, as I look back on it, I thought everything was handled well, and it was. It was a great demonstration of how a court case should be handled. I've often thought about my experience and wondered, what if the scenario was different? What if the judge was a tyrant and there was no jury at all? What if the prosecuting attorney built his case around empty, trumped-up accusations? What if there was no defense attorney to make a defense, but only the one accused of wrongdoing? They were forced to defend themselves. That, in fact, is the scene that the Apostle Paul was faced with in Acts chapter 24. Paul's on trial. He's being accused by the Sanhedrin of some wrongdoing. There's no jury. There's just a judge with a reputation for cruelty. And there's also a prosecuting attorney, and is really good, we're going to see, at hurling insults. Now, before we visit the courtroom Paul was subject to, I want to make it clear, this kind of a court is what has been labeled a kangaroo court. A kangaroo court is when someone is using the phrase kangaroo. They're talking about a court which does not follow the usual rules and is dishonest in its nature. What's interesting is the kangaroo court is believed to have gotten its name in Australian penal system over 100 years ago, where a judge would jump around from one position to another depending on whatever position served their best personal interest. And so what we're going to see here is this court case that Paul is going to go through. Well, it's a kangaroo court at best. Let's examine how we got here. Let's go back and get some context before we look into just verses 1 through 9 of Acts chapter 24. The Apostle Paul had completed his 3rd missionary journey. Paul was on his way to Jerusalem, even after being warned on 3 particular occasions not to go to Jerusalem. He was warned by some caring friends. His friends were afraid Paul would be accosted by the Jewish populace. that refused to believe in Jesus. Now, upon Paul's arrival at the temple in Jerusalem, he was in fact accosted. Paul was attacked. If not for the intervention of the Romans, Paul would have been killed. And so at that time, Paul asked the Roman commander, his name was Lysias. He asked Lysias if he could speak to this crowd that wanted to kill him. As he spoke, it didn't go well. But again, the Romans intervened a second time. Paul was rescued. He was then taken to the Jewish authorities called the Sanhedrin. You remember them. They're the ones who 25 years earlier, they ruled against Jesus. Well, as Paul's beginning to speak to them, they don't listen either. And a third time, Lysias, the Roman commander, rescues Paul. And so as Paul is sitting in a cell in Jerusalem, there was a plot to murder him that was uncovered. It was at the hands of 40 men who were set against Christianity. They were called zealots. Once again, the Roman commander, Lysias, realized if Paul is going to get a fair trial, well, he needs to send Paul to Caesarea. Caesarea is about 40 miles away from Jerusalem. It sits on the coast of Jerusalem, where Paul would appear there at Caesarea before Felix, the Roman governor. So Lysias sends Paul to Caesarea, 40 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Paul is escorted by 470 soldiers, 200 foot soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 guys who are experts at throwing a spear. And Paul is placed in custody at Caesarea and is held until his accusers in Jerusalem arrive to be tried in front of Felix. Felix, the Roman governor. What do we know about Felix, the Roman governor? Well, what we know is he was a shady character. Felix was known for his cruelty. Felix was also known for taking bribes. During Felix's rule in Judea, crime increased. His period of rule was marked by internal feuds and disturbances, which he would put down with a heavy, unmerciful hand. Morally, Felix was a man with little conviction. Felix was attracted to a woman named Drusilla, not to be confused with one of Cinderella's stepsisters, Drizella. The problem was, as he was attracted to Drusilla, Drusilla was the daughter of the puppet king Herod. Problem, Drusilla was married to somebody else. That didn't matter to Felix. He had the power of an army behind him, being the Roman governor, so he took Drusilla away from her husband. His name was Azizus, and he married her himself. This background gives you some sort of insight into what kind of a person he is. It also gives you some insight into what kind of a judge Felix might be. Now we pick up our story in Acts chapter 24, verse 1. In verses 1 through 9, a contingent representing the Sanhedrin, which included the high priest, his name was Ananias, and there were also several elders. It also included a prosecuting attorney, his name was Tertullus. Everybody say this with me, Tertullus. Okay, now you won't be afraid of the name. Tertullus, to be sure, well, he came because he had a way of persuasion, and he wanted to make the best argument possible against the Apostle Paul. Anything less than the death penalty, well, that would be a disappointment. If Paul and his ministry were allowed to continue, that would be basically a continual thorn in the side of these religious leaders, and they couldn't bear the thought of it. So this revengeful contingent of these Jewish leaders traveled 40 miles to help convict Paul and to get him dead. We pick it up in chapter 24, verse 1. So it says this: after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders. The reason it says he came down is because everything is relative to geography. Jerusalem was a higher altitude. Caesarea was on the shoreline, so that's why it says he came down with the elders. And they came with this attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. What do we know about Tertullus? Well, he had the reputation as a smooth-talking, persuasive prosecuting attorney. Chances are Tertullus never met Paul, nor did he care if Paul was guilty or not. He was a hired gun representing the desires of the Sanhedrin. Now remember, back in Jerusalem, there was this group of these 40 zealots, and they plotted to ambush and murder Paul. The Sanhedrin agreed to be accomplices by inviting Paul to come and dialogue with them. The Sanhedrin, they were the bait. Well, this group of zealots, they were the trap. These zealots were going to ambush Paul as he went to meet with the Sanhedrin, and they were going to kill him there. So here's this Sanhedrin. Think about this. These are the Jewish leaders. They are adherents to keeping the 10 Commandments at all cost. And yet, here they are, rationalizing away lying and murder, as if those things are okay if they got rid of Paul. Their sin is so obvious, and they don't even see it. But they're in deep. And they're calling evil good and good evil, and they don't even recognize that they are under a curse by doing so. When I say that, you remember there's this phrase, it's recorded in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, that says, "Woe to you who call evil good and good evil." The woe there is promised curse from God. If you call good evil and evil good, well, you can guarantee that you're going to be under a curse from God. Now, for the sake of communication, I'm dividing chapter 24 up over the next 2 Sundays. This Sunday, we will go into Felix's courtroom and observe the prosecuting attorney's case against Paul. We're only going to look at verses 1 through 9. Next week, we will examine how Paul defends himself against some trumped-up charges. Now, keep in mind, all of this is taking place in a kangaroo court. Felix's verdict will be based on what is best for him and his political career and how he will bounce around. We're going to see how he's going to bounce around to get there. So let's pick it up in verses 2 through 4. Keep in mind, as we read verse 2 through 4, Tertullus begins his argument against Paul. Let's go into the courtroom and let's observe, starting in verse 2. After Paul had summoned Tertullus, began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us, by your kindness, a brief hearing." Now think about this. Tertullus begins his accusations by not accusing Paul of anything. Tertullus starts showering Felix with praise for the accomplishments that Felix has never done. He starts off and he says, "Since you attained much peace." What peace are they talking about? Under Felix, crime has risen. Uprisings against Rome have increased. Divisions have increased because of bribes. What peace are we talking about here, Tertullus? He continues on. This is pretty smart on Tertullus's part. Felix is a whitewashed wall. He cares nothing about reality. Next week, we're going to see Felix cares more about how he's perceived than he cares about his integrity. So Tertullus continues his way. He says, "Your reforms, Felix, are being carried out." And again, you're looking at this and you go, what reforms? Word was that any uprising by a surrounding village, the Roman army would come in and just kill everybody. Now, I don't know about you, but reform seems to demand working with people from different perspectives and finding common ground that will benefit all parties involved. A reformer by nature should be a peacemaker. Felix, no peacemaker. Goes along. You know, is my mic kind of going in and out? Do you mind if I do this? I'm going to just grab this. We can turn that off. How are we doing? All right. I would rather be heard than you go in and out. So forgive me for that. So he goes, you Let me go back again here, where we are. Okay? Ready? Take two. Okay, there we go. So a reformer's a peacemaker, right? Felix is no peacemaker. Tertullus goes on and he says, and we thank and tell everyone about your work. You, most excellent Felix, you. It's kind of like, you crazy guy, Felix, you're the best. Tertullus goes on, he says, you got a lot on your plate. Give us some more of that good old Felix kindness. Now, when you look at the opening argument of Tertullus, never has there been a more manipulative opening argument in a court of law. Tertullus appeals to Felix in every way that is opposite of who Felix is. Manipulation is used for the purpose of causing the one you are manipulating to feel obligated to you. Now, we're going to look at verse 5 and 6. Verse 5 and 6 contains the meat of the accusations against Paul. Look at verse 5 and 6. It says, for we have found this man, again, this is Tertullus speaking. He's speaking about Paul. He says, we found this man a real pest and a fellow who stirs up dissension among the Jews throughout the world. And he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. In verse 6, we talked about sex last hour with the guys, but verse 6 says, and he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our law. Now, I want you to observe the four accusations against Paul here. First is, he calls him a pest. Another translation would use the word plague. Somebody who pollutes people's minds with subversive ideas. Well, that's a pest. And so you're subverting people's minds and turning them against Rome, is Tertullus's argument. By being called a pest, you're equated as a terrorist. You pest. You want nothing more than to rid the world of Rome by affecting the people. So he starts off, all he's doing is he's building a case. He's name-calling. That's all he's doing. The second accusation, he says, you stir up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. Now, this second accusation is the closest of the four accusations to being true. But I would argue that it's really more of a half-truth. I would argue that this accusation Paul is teaching has not pitted Jew against Jew. Paul's teaching about Jesus has caused some Jews to persecute Christ followers because they have rejected Jesus as the clear Messiah that the Old Testament predicted. Here's the third accusation. He says, Paul, you're a ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes. Well, this is an argument of guilt by association. Jesus was a Nazarene. Nazareth had the reputation of this dead-end city. Interesting, Nazareth is where Jesus was. That was Jesus' hometown. His hometown was a village known for being a bunch of down-and-outers. I think the high school mascot in Nazareth was the down-and-outer. I just made that up. I have no idea if that's true or not. But he says, I remember John in chapter 1 said this in verse 46, where he said about Nazareth. He said, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. Isn't it interesting? That's the city that Jesus chose to come out of. So in Tertullus's argument, he wants to emotionally taint Felix's opinion of Paul. He's basically doing name-calling. He's saying, you are a filthy Nazarene lover. Final accusation against Paul. Says he wanted to desecrate the temple. Tertullus now uses the false narrative that Paul encouraged a Gentile to enter into part of the Jewish temple that Gentiles were forbidden to go through. We looked at that in Acts chapter 21. It's a lie. But Felix really doesn't care. You and I know the only thing Paul is guilty of is following Jesus. We also know the only thing that Tertullus could find Paul truly guilty of is that which was they were unwilling to prosecute Paul for. And that would be Paul's previous actions that led to the deaths of Christ's followers before Paul was converted. But the Sanhedrin and Tertullus certainly don't want to find fault with that. All Tertullus has done, he's built a case based upon name-calling. You're a pest. You're a Nazarite lover. And then he's built it around false narratives. You brought Gentiles into the temple. Lie. He's pitting Jews against Jews. Lie. By the way, just a quick side note. I think most of our wrong opinions of others are formed by name-calling and false narratives. It's an effective way to turn someone against someone else that you don't really have a history with. A friend of yours comes up to you and says something like, well, he's a Nazarite lover. He's a Nazarene lover. Oh, well, I shouldn't like him either. And then you're going, well, what's a Nazarene lover? You're formed by the opinion. You're not formed by fact. Now, as we're going to examine verse 7 and 9, I want you to observe how Tertullus continues his strategy of manipulating Felix. Verse 7 through 9, it says, but Lysias, the commander, you remember, he's the Roman commander in Jerusalem. But Lysias, the commander, came along, and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you, by examining him yourself concerning all these matters. You will be able to ascertain the things which we accuse him of. Verse 9, the Jews also joined in the attack, meaning the Sanhedrin, asserting that these things were so. Tertullus is giving Felix some shaded information. He's building his argument around, well, remember Lysias, your own Roman commander in Jerusalem? Well, he took Paul off our hands and brought him here to be judged. But as you can see, he is in fact guilty of all that we originally accused him of. Insinuating to Felix, since you obviously agree with us about Paul's guilt, sorry that we're even wasting your time. This was an empty prosecution, void of an accusation with teeth. But it is a very effective way to deal with someone vulnerable to lies. Tertullus is appealing to Felix indirectly. We ought to keep Lysias out of this situation. And the reason he's appealing that is, remember, Lysias was the one who made the comment that I find no guilt found in Paul whatsoever. Lysias' testimony, he knows, will hurt Tertullus' argument. The Sanhedrin, the contingency present, said, here, we agree with everything Tertullus is saying. Now, in their response, I hear the same response that was given some 25 years earlier by their Jewish fathers at Jesus' trial. You remember in Matthew 27:25 when they said, let his death be on our heads. And I can hear the words of Tertullus at this point say, the prosecution rests. Now, don't miss this. I want you to observe something. This Kangaroo Court mirrors the court proceedings that Satan attempts to orchestrate for each one of us. Let me build my case. Satan wants our judge, our Heavenly Father, to jump around at his beckon. Satan plays the part of a prosecuting attorney. He uses name-calling. He uses false narratives to accuse us. And Satan uses all of our past recordings that hell's stenographer has written down about our past sins. It's a kangaroo court. It's what Satan attempts to organize, and Satan has no official jurisdiction. He tries to convict us before there has even been a trial. He is our great accuser. I want you to be mindful of all of those accusations that come in your mind. All of those thoughts that you beat yourself up over. All of those thoughts that you beat yourself up over, they did not originate with God. They originated with the evil one who wants to set you up in his kangaroo court. But here's what Paul knows. And here's what Paul wants us to know on this day, on the 6th of April. What we need to understand. What you and I, in the midst of all the accusations that come our way, What we need to understand is what John writes in 1 John chapter 2, verse 1, where the Apostle John confirms Jesus is our advocate. He is our defense attorney. Jesus pleads our case before the Father, even though Satan and all of hell try to accuse us of sin and incompetence and wrongdoing. Jesus stands in our defense with the proof in his nail-scarred hands that he has paid for our sin with his blood. And that work on the cross is the declaration that our innocence is complete. Jesus is the living proof that we are innocent of all the charges Satan has mustered up against us. Because Jesus stood in our place and took the punishment that we deserve. See, God the Father declares our case as thrown out because Satan is trying to turn God's courtroom into a kangaroo court, and it cannot be done. I want us to take the offering at this time, but I don't want you to have the mentality that the service is over. But I want to take a quick break. I want us to do the offering. And I want you, as the offering is being placed, to just meditate on the question, what are the lies that you are buying into yourself? You are buying into about yourself. What are the lies that you are buying into about yourself? You know, I learned a long time ago that when you are accused by the evil one, the best thing you can do is say to the evil one under your breath is to say, take it to the cross, Satan. You have no jurisdiction here. Your accusation has no teeth. And yet, he continues to accuse. So what are the lies you buy into about yourself?